Hi, good morning. Good morning. Good morning. This is June 27th, 2019. We're still reading from the Celestine Prophecy with James Redfield. And just happens that we left off last time right at the end of a chapter. So today we're going to be starting with a brand new chapter. And this chapter is called The Magic of the Mystics. So, no further ado, as they say, I will start reading. The Message of the Mystics. The next morning, I awoke as soon as I heard Will stirring. We had spent the night at a house belonging to one of his friends, and Will was sitting up in a cot across the room. Dressing quickly, it was still dark outside. "Let's get packed," he whispered. We gathered our clothes and made several trips out to the Jeep with some extra supplies Will had bought. The center of the town was only a few hundred yards away, but few lights penetrated the darkness. Dawn was but a streak of lighter sky towards the east. Other than a few birds signaling the impending morning, there were no sounds. When we finished, I stayed with the Jeep while Will spoke briefly with his friend, who stood steeply on the porch where we completed our packing. Suddenly we heard noise at the crossroads. We could see the lights of 3 trucks as they drove into the center of the town and stopped. "That could be Jensen," Will said. "Let's walk over there and see what they're doing, but carefully." We made our way across several streets and into an alley that entered the main road about 100 feet from the trucks. 2 of the vehicles were being filled with fuel, and the other was parked in front of the store. 4 or 5 people stood nearby. I saw Marjorie walk out of the store and place something in the truck. Then there walked casually towards us, gazing into the adjacent shops. "Walk over there and see if you can get her to come with us," Will whispered. "I'll wait for you here." I slipped around the corner, and as I walked toward her, I was horrified. Behind her, in front of the store, I noticed for the first time that several of Jensen's men carried automatic weapons. A few moments later, my friend intensified. In the street across from me, armed soldiers crouched low and slowly approached Jensen's group. At that exact time, Marjorie saw me. Jensen's men saw the others and scattered. A burst of machine gun fire filled the air. Marjorie looked at me with terror in her eyes. I rushed forward and grabbed her. We ducked into the next alley. More shots were being fired amid angry shouting in Spanish. We tripped over a pile of empty cartons and fell, our faces almost touching. "Let's go," I said, jumping to my feet. She struggled up, then pulled me down again, nodding ahead to the end of the alley. 2 men with weapons were hiding with their backs to us. Looking down the next street, we froze. Finally, the men raced across the street to the wooded area beyond. I knew we had to get back to the house of Wilson's friend. To the Jeep, I was sure Will would go there. We crept carefully to the next street. Angry shouting and gunfire could be heard toward the right, but we could see no one. I looked left, nothing there either. No sign of Will. I figured he had run ahead of us. "Let's run across to the woods," I said to Marjorie, who was now alert and looking determined. Then I continued, "We'll stay along the edge of the woods and bear left. The Jeep was parked in that direction." "Okay," she said. We crossed the street quickly and made our way to within 100 feet or so to the house. The Jeep was still there, but we could see no movement anywhere. As we prepared to dash across the last street to the house, a military vehicle turned a corner to our left and proceeded slowly toward the dwelling. Simultaneously, Will ran across the yard, started the Jeep, and sped away in the opposite direction. The vehicle pursued. Damn, I said. What do we do now? Marjorie asked, panic returning to her face. More shots were being fired in the streets behind us. Closer this time. Ahead, the forest thickened and climbed up the ridge which towered over the town and ran north and south. It was the same ridge that I had seen from the overlook earlier. Let's get to the top, I said. Hurry. We climbed several hundred yards up the ridge. At an overlook, we stopped and looked back toward the town. Military vehicles seemed to be pouring into the crossroads, and numerous soldiers were conducting what seemed to be a house-to-house search below us. At the base of the ridge, I could hear muffled voices. We rushed further up the mountain. All we could do now was run. We followed the ridge north all morning, stopping only to crouch down when a vehicle traveled along the ridge parallel to us on our left. Most of the traffic was the same steel gray military Jeep we had seen before, but occasionally a civilian vehicle would pass. Ironically, the road provided a lone landmark and point of security against the wilderness all around us. Ahead, the two ridges grew closer together and more steeply sloped. Jagged outcroppings of rocks protected the valley floor. Suddenly, from the north, we saw a Jeep like Will's approach, then turn quickly onto a side road which looped down into the valley. That looks like Will, I said, straining to see. Let's get down there, Marjorie said. Wait a minute. What if it's a trap? What if they've captured him and are using the Jeep to lure us out? Her face fell. You stay here, I said. I'll go down there and you watch me. If everything's okay, then I'll motion for you to follow. Reluctantly, she agreed and started down the steep mountain toward the spot where the Jeep had parked. Through the foliage, I could vaguely see someone get out of the vehicle, but I couldn't see who it was. Holding on to the small bushes and trees, I worked my way between the outcroppings, occasionally sliding down in the thick humus. Finally, the vehicle was directly across from me on the opposite slope, perhaps 100 yards away. The driver leaned against a rear fender, was still obscured. I moved to my right to get a better look. It was Will. I rushed further to my right and felt myself slide. At the last moment, I reached for a tree trunk and pulled myself back up. My stomach twisted with fright. Below me was a sheer drop-off of 30 feet or more. I had barely avoided killing myself. Still holding the tree, I stood up and tried to gain Will's attention. He was surveying the ridge above my head, and then his eyes dropped, and he looked right at me. He jerked up and walked toward me in the bushes. I pointed down to the steep gorge. He surveyed the valley floor, then called to me. I don't see a way across, he said. You'll have to move down the valley and across there. I nodded and was about to signal Marjorie when I heard a vehicle approaching in the distance. Will jumped into his Jeep and sped back toward the main road. I hurried up the hill. I could see Marjorie through the foliage walking toward me. Suddenly, from the area behind her came loud shouts in Spanish and the sounds of people running. Marjorie hid below a rock overhang. I changed directions, running as quickly as I could to the left as I ran. I searched for a view of Marjorie through the trees. Just as I caught sight of her, she screamed loudly as two soldiers grabbed her arms and forced her to stand. I continued to run up the slope, keeping low, her look of panic frozen in my mind. Once at the top of the ridge, I headed north again, my heart pounding with terror and panic. After running more than a mile, I stopped and listened. I could hear no movement or talking behind me. Lying flat on my back, I tried to relax and think clearly. But the awkward specter of Marjorie's capture was overwhelming. Why did I ask her to remain on the ridge alone? What should I do now? I sat up and took a deep breath and gazed over the road at the other ridge. I had seen no traffic while I was running. Again, I listened intently, nothing except for the usual forest sounds. Slowly, I began to calm down. After all, Marjorie had only been captured. She was guilty of nothing except running from gunfire. Probably she would be detained only until her identity as a legitimate scientist could be established. Once more, I headed north, my back aching slightly. I felt dirty and tired, and pangs of hunger erupted in my stomach. For 2 hours, I walked without thinking and without seeing anyone. Then, from the slopes of my right, I heard sounds of running. I froze and listened again, but the sounds had stopped. Here, the trees were larger, shielding the ground below from the sun, thinning the underbrush. I could see 50 or 60 yards. Nothing moved. I walked past a large boulder on my right and several trees, stepping as softly as possible. 3 other massive outcroppings lay along my path, and I moved past 2 of them. Still no movement. I walked around the 3rd boulder. Twigs cracked behind me. I turned around slowly. There, next to the rock, was the bearded man I had seen at Jensen's farm. His eyes wide, panicked, his arms shaking as he pointed an automatic weapon at my stomach. He seemed to be suggesting to remember me, struggling to remember me. "Wait a minute," I stammered. "I know Jensen." He looked at me more closely and lowered the weapon. Then from the woods behind us, we heard the sounds of someone moving. The bearded man ran past me toward the north, holding the rifle in one hand. Instinctively, I followed. Both of us were running as fast as we could, dodging limbs and rocks and occasionally glancing back. After several hundred yards, he stumbled and I raced past him. I collapsed between 2 rocks to rest and to look back, trying to detect movement. I saw a lone soldier, 50 yards away, raise his rifle toward the huge man, who was struggling to his feet. Before I could utter a warning, the soldier fired. The man's chest exploded as bullets tore through from the rear, splattering me with blood. An echo of rifle fire filled the air. For an instant he stood motionless, his eyes glazed. Then his body arced forward and fell. I reacted blindly, running north again away from the soldiers, keeping the trees between me and the area from which the bullets had come. The ridge grew constantly more rugged and rocky and began to incline dramatically upwards. My entire body shook with exhaustion and terror as I struggled up the spaces between the outcroppings. At one point I slipped and dared to glance backward. The soldier was approaching the body. I slithered around a rock just as the soldier looked up, seemingly right at me. I stayed low to the ground and crawled past several other boulders. Then the slope of the ridge leveled off, blocking the soldier's view, so I jumped to my feet again, running as fast as I could between the rocks and the trees. My mind was numb. Escape was all I could think of. Though I didn't dare look back, I was sure I heard the soldier running behind me. The ridge inclined ahead, and I fought my way up, my strength beginning to wane, and at the top of the rise the ground leveled out and was thick with all tall trees and lush undergrowth. Rising behind them was a sheer rock face that I had to scale delicately, searching for hand and footholds as I proceeded. I struggled to the top, and my heart fell at the sight before me. A drop-off of 100 feet or more blocked my way. I could go no further. I was doomed, finished. Rocks slid along the outcropping behind me, indicating the soldier was closing fast. I sank to my knees. I was exhausted, spent, and with a final sigh, I released the last of my flight, accepting my fate. Soon I knew the bullets would come, and interestingly, as an end to the terror, death seemed almost a welcome relief. As I waited, my mind flashed to childhood Sundays and to the innocent contemplation of God. What would it be like? Death. I tried to open myself to the experience. After a long period of waiting, during which I had no concept of time, I suddenly became aware that nothing had happened. I looked around and noticed for the first time that I was positioned on the highest peak of the mountain. Other ridges and cliffs fell away from this point, leaving me with a panoramic view in all directions. A movement caught my eye. There, far down the slope toward the south, walking casually away from me, was the soldier. The gun belonging to Jensen's man slung across one arm. The sight warmed my body and filled me with ripples of silent laughter. I had somehow survived. I turned and sat cross-legged and savored the euphoria. I wanted to stay here forever. The day was brilliant with sunshine and blue sky. I sat there. I was struck by the closeness of the purple hills in the distance, or rather the feeling that they were close. The same perception applied to the few puffs of white clouds drifting overhead. I felt as if I could reach out and touch them with my hand. As I reached up toward the sky, I noticed something different about the way my body felt. My arm had glided upward with incredible ease, and I was holding my back, neck, and head perfectly straight with absolutely no effort. From my position, sitting cross-legged, I stood up without using my arms and stretched. The feeling was one of total lightness. Looking at the distant mountains, I noticed that a daytime moon had been out and was about to set. It looked to be about a quarter full and hung over the horizon like an inverted bowl. Instantly, I understood why it had that shape. The sun, millions of miles directly above me, was shining only on the top of the sinking moon. I could perceive the exact line between the sun and the lunar surface, and this recognition somehow extended my consciousness outward even further. I could imagine the moon having already dipped below the horizon and the exact reflected shape it would present to those who lived further west and could still see it. Then I imagined how it would look when it moved directly under me on the other side of the planet. To the people there, it would appear full because the sun over my head would shine past the earth and strike the moon squarely. This picture sent a rush of sensation up my spine, and my back seemed to straighten even more as I conceived. No, I experienced the same amount of space commonly felt over my head as also existing under my feet. On the other side of the globe, for the first time in my life, I knew the Earth's roundness not as an intellectual concept, but as an actual sensation. At one level, this awareness excited me, but at another, it seemed perfectly ordinary and natural. All I wanted to do was immerse myself in the feeling of being suspended, floating amid a space that existed in all directions. Rather than having to push myself away from the earth with my legs as I stood there, resisting the earth's gravity, I now felt as though I was held up by some inner buoyancy, as though I was filled like a balloon with just enough helium to hover over the ground and barely touch it with my feet. It was similar to being in perfect athletic condition, as after a year of intense exercise, only far more coordinated and light. I sat down again on the rock, and again everything seemed close. The rugged outcrop on which I was sitting, the tall trees further down the slope, and the other mountains on the horizon. And as I watched the limbs of the trees sway gently in the breeze, I experienced not just a visual perception of the event, but a physical sensation as well, as if the limbs moving in the wind were hairs on my body. I perceived everything to be somewhat part of me. As I sat on the peak of the mountain looking out at the landscape falling away from me in all directions. It felt exactly as if I had always known as my physical body was only the head of a much larger body consisting of everything else I could see. I experienced the entire universe looking out on itself through my eyes. This perception induced a flash of memory. My mind raced backwards in time, past the beginning of my trip to Peru, past my childhood and my birth. The realization was present that my life did not, in fact, begin with my conception and birth on this planet. It began much earlier with the formation of the rest of me, my real body, the universe itself. The science of evolution had always bored me, but now as my mind continued to race backward in time, all the things I had read on the subject began to come back to me, including conversations with the friends who resembled Rene. I called that this was the field he was interested in, evolution. All knowledge seemed to merge with actual memories. Somehow I was recalling what had happened, and the recollection allowed me to look at evolution in a new way. I watched as the first matter exploded into the universe, and I realized as the third insight had described, that there was nothing truly solid about it. Matter was only energy, vibrating at a certain level. And in the beginning, matter existed only in its simplest vibratory form, the element we call hydrogen. That's all there was in the universe, just hydrogen. I observed the hydrogen atoms begin to gravitate together as if the ruling principle, the urge of this energy, was to begin a movement into a more complex state. And when pockets of this hydrogen reached a sufficient density, it began to heat up and to burn, to become what we call a star. And in this burning of the hydrogen, fused together and leaped into the next higher vibration, the element we call helium. As I continued to watch these first stars age and finally blew themselves up and spewed the remaining hydrogen and the newly created helium out into the universe, and the whole process began again. The hydrogen and helium gravitated together until the temperatures became hot enough for the new stars to form, and that in turn fused the helium together, creating the element lithium, which vibrated at the next higher level, and so on. Each successive generation of stars creating matter that had not existed before, until the wide spectrum of matter, the basic chemical elements, had been formed and scattered everywhere. Matter had evolved from the element hydrogen, the simplest vibration of energy, to carbon, which vibrated at an extremely high rate. The stage was now set for the next step in evolution. As our sun formed, pockets of matter fell into orbit around it, and one of them, the Earth, contained all the newly created elements, including carbon. As the Earth cooled, gases once caught in the molten mass migrated to the surface and merged together to form water vapor. And the great rains came, forming oceans on the barren crust. Then, when water covered much of the Earth's surface, the skies cleared and the sun, burning brightly, bathed the new world with light and heat and radiation. And in the shadow, pools and basins, amid the great lightning storms that periodically swept the planet, matter leaped past the vibratory level of carbon to an even more complex state, to the vibration represented by the amino acids. But for the first time, this new level of vibration was not stable in and of itself. Matter had to continually absorb other matter into itself in order to sustain its vibration. It had to eat. Life, the new thrust of evolution, had emerged. Still restricted to living only in water, I saw this life split into distant forms. One form, the one we call plants, lived on inorganic matter and turned these elements into food by utilizing carbon dioxide from the early atmosphere. As a byproduct, plants released free oxygen into the world for the first time. Plant life spread quickly through the oceans and finally onto the land as well. The other form, what we call animals, absorbed only organic life to sustain their vibration. As I watched, the animals filled the oceans in the great age of fishes, and when the plants had released enough oxygen into the atmosphere, began their own trek toward land. I saw the amphibians, half fish, half something new, leave the water for the first time and use lungs to breathe the new air. Then matter leaped forward again into reptiles and covered the earth in the great period of the dinosaurs. Then the warm-blooded mammals came and likewise have covered the earth, and I realized that each emerging species represented life, matter moving into its next higher vibration. Finally, the progression ended. There at the pinnacle stood humankind. Humankind, the vision ended. I had seen in one flash the entire story of evolution, the story of matter coming into being and then evolving, as if under some guiding plan toward even higher vibrations, creating the exact conditions, finally, for humans to emerge, for each of us as individuals to emerge. As I sat there on that mountain, I could almost grasp how this evolution was extended even further in the lives of human beings. Further evolution was related somehow to the experience of life coincidences. Something about these events led us forward in our lives and created a higher vibration that pushed evolution ahead as well. Yet, as hard as I tried, I couldn't quite understand. For a long time, I sat on the rock, preoccupied, consumed by peace and completeness. Then, abruptly, I became aware that the sun was beginning to sink in the west. I also noticed that toward the northwest, about a mile, was a town of some kind. I could make out the shapes of rooftops. The road on the west ridge seemed to meander right to it. I got up and began the climb down the rocks. I laughed out loud. I was still connected with the landscape so that I felt I was walking alongside my own body, and more that I was exploring the regions of my own body. The feeling was exhilarating. I made my way down the bluff and into the trees. The afternoon sun cast long shadows along the forest floor. Halfway down, I came to a particular thick area of large trees, and as I entered, I experienced a perceptible change in my body. I felt even lighter and more coordinated. I stopped and looked closely at the trees and underlying bushes, focusing on their shapes and beauty. I could see flickers of white light and what seemed like a pinkish glow around the plant. I continued to walk, coming to a stream that radiated pale blue and filled me with enhanced tranquility and even a drowsiness. Eventually, I made my way across the valley floor and up the next ridge until I came to the road. I pulled myself up to the gravel surface and walked casually along the shoulder toward the north. Up ahead, I caught the sight of a man in a priest's robe rounding the next bend. The sight thrilled me. Totally without fear, I jogged ahead to talk with him. I knew I would know exactly what to say and do. I had a feeling of perfect well-being, but to my surprise, he had disappeared. To the right, another road angled back into the valley, but I could see no one in that direction. I ran farther up the main road, but I saw no one there either. I thought about going back and taking the road I had passed, but I knew the town was ahead, so I continued to walk that way. Still, I thought several more times of the other road. 100 yards farther, as I rounded another curve, I heard the roar of vehicles. Through the trees, I could see a line of military trucks approaching at high rate of speed. For a moment, I hesitated, thinking I might stand by ground, but then I remembered the terror of the shooting on the ridge. I had time only to fling myself off the road to the right and lie still. 10 jeeps sped past me. I had landed in a spot which was completely exposed, and all I could do was hope no one looked my way. Each vehicle passed within 20 feet. I could smell the exhaust fumes and see the expression on every face. Luckily, no one noticed. After they were well past, I crawled behind a large tree. My hands were shaking, and my sensation of peace and connection was totally shattered. A now familiar pang of anxiety knotted in my stomach. Finally, I inched up to the road. The sound of more vehicles sent me scurrying down the slope again as 2 more jeeps raced past. I felt nauseous. This time I stayed well off the road and retreated the way I had come, moving very cautiously. I came to the road I had passed earlier. after carefully listening for sound and movement, I decided to walk through the woods beside it, angling back into the valley. My body felt heavy again. What had I been doing? I asked myself. Why had I been walking in the road? I must have been crazy, deluded by the shock of the shooting, entranced in some state of euphoria. Yet real, I told myself. You have to be careful. There are people here who kill and will kill if you make the slightest mistake. I froze. Ahead of me, perhaps 100 feet, was the priest. He was sitting under a large tree that was surrounded by numerous rock outcroppings. As I stared at him, he opened his eyes and looked right at me. I flinched, but he only smiled and motioned me to walk up. Cautiously, I approached him. He remained motionless. A thin, tall man of about 50 years of age. His hair was cut short and was dark brown in color, matching his eyes. You look as though you need some help, he said in perfect English. Who are you? I asked. I'm Father Sanchez. And you? I explained who I was and where I was from, dizzily sinking to one knee and then to my buttocks. You were part of what happened in Kula, weren't you? He asked. What do you know of that? I asked worryingly, not knowing whether to trust him. I know someone in this government is very angry, he said. They don't want the manuscript published. Why? I asked. He stood up and looked down at me. Why don't you come with me? Our mission is only a half a mile away. You'll be safe with us. I struggled to my feet, realizing I had no choice, and nodded affirmatively. He led me slowly down the road, his manner respectful and deliberate. He weighed each word. Are the soldiers still looking for you? He asked at one point. I don't know, I replied. He said nothing for a minute, then asked, are you searching for the manuscript? Not anymore, I said. Right now, I just want to survive this and go home. He nodded reassuringly, and I found myself beginning to trust him. Something about his regard and warmth affected me. He reminded me of Will. Presently we came to the mission, which was a cluster of small houses facing a courtyard and a small church. It was situated in a place of great beauty. As we walked up, he told some of the other robed men something in Spanish, and they scurried away. I tried to see where they were going, but fatigue was engulfing me. The priest led me into one of the houses. Inside was a small living area and 2 bedrooms. A fire burned in the fireplace. Soon after we entered, another priest walked in with a tray of bread and soup. Wearily I ate as Sanchez sat politely in a chair beside me. But then, upon his insistence, I stretched out on one of the beds and fell into a deep sleep. When I walked into the courtyard, I noticed immediately that the grounds were immaculately kept. Gravel walkways were edged with precisely arranged bushes and hedges. Each seemed to be placed so as to accent their full natural shape. None were trimmed. I stretched and felt the starched shirt I had put on. It was made of coarse cloth and chafed my neck slightly. Still, it was clean and freshly ironed. Earlier, I had awakened as 2 priests poured hot water into a tub and laid out fresh clothes. After I had bathed and dressed, I had walked into the other room and found hot muffins and dried fruit on the table. I had eaten ravenously while the priest stood by. After I'd finished, the priest had left, and I had walked outside to where now I stood. I walked over and sat on one of the stone benches that faced the courtyard. The sun was just clearing the tops of the trees, warming my face. "How did you sleep?" a voice asked from behind me. I turned to see Father Sanchez standing with very erect, smiling down at me. "Very well," I replied. "May I join you?" "Sure." Neither of us spoke for several minutes, so long, in fact, that it felt some discomfort. Several times I looked at him, preparing to say something, but he was looking in the direction of the sun. His face tilted slightly back, his eyes squinting. Finally he spoke. "This is a nice place you found here." Apparently he meant the bench at this time of the morning. "Look, I need to ask your advice," I said. "What is the safest way for me to get back to the United States?" He looked at me seriously. "I don't know. That depends on how dangerous the government thinks you are. Tell me how you happen to be in Kula." I told him everything from the time I first heard of the manuscript. By feeling the euphoria on the ridge now seemed fanciful and pretentious, so I only alluded to it briefly. Sanchez, however, immediately questioned me about it. "What did you do after the soldier failed to notice you and left?" he asked. "I just sat up there for a few hours," I replied, feeling relieved, I guess. "What else did you feel?" he asked. I squirmed somewhat, then decided to attempt a description. "It's hard to describe," I said. "I felt this euphoria connection with everything, and this total kind of security and confidence was no longer tired." He smiled. "You had a mystical experience. Many people report them in that forest near the peak." I nodded tentatively. He turned on the bench to face me more directly. "This is the experience the mystics of every religion have always described. Have you read anything about such experiences?" "Some years ago," I said, "but until yesterday it was only an intellectual concept." "Yeah, I suppose." The young priest walked up and nodded to me, then whispered something to Sanchez. Sanchez nodded, and the young priest turned and walked away. The older priest watched every step the young man took. He crossed the courtyard and entered a park-like area about 100 feet away. I noticed for the first time that this area, too, was also extremely clean and full of various plants. The young priest walked to several locations, hesitating at each one as though searching for something. Then at one specific location sat down. He appeared to be engaged in an exercise of some kind. Sanchez smiled and looked pleasant, then turned his attention to me. "I think it is probably unsafe for you to attempt to go back right now," he said, "but I will try to find out what the situation is and if there is any word about your friends." He stood up and faced me. "I must attend to some chores. Please understand that we will assist you in any way possible. For now, I hope you will be comfortable here, relax and gain your strength." And I nodded. He reached inside his pocket and pulled out some papers and handed them to me. "This is the fifth insight. It speaks about the kind of experience you had. I think you might find it interesting." I took it reluctantly as he continued speaking. "What was your understanding of the last insight you read?" he asked. I hesitated. I didn't want to think about manuscripts and insights. Finally, I said, that humans are stuck in a kind of competition for others' energy. When we can get others to acquiesce to our view, they identify with us, and that pulls their energy into us, and we feel stronger. He smiled. So the problem is that everyone is trying to control and manipulate each other for energy because we feel short of it. That's right. But there is no solution, another source of energy. That's what the last insight implied. He nodded and walked very deliberately into the church. For a few moments, I leaned forward and rested my elbows on my knees. Now looking at the translation, I continued to feel reluctant. The events of the last 2 days had dampened my enthusiasm, and I preferred instead to think of how I might return to the United States. Then in the wooded area across the way, I noticed the young priest stand up and walk slowly towards another location about 20 feet from where he was. He turned toward me again and sat down. I was intrigued over what he might be doing. Then it dawned on me that he might be practicing something that was spelled out in the manuscript. I looked at the first page and began to read. It described a new understanding of what has long been called mystical consciousness. During the last decades of the 20th century, it stated this consciousness would become publicized as a way of being that is actually attainable, a way that has been demonstrated by the more esoteric practitioners of many religions. For most, this consciousness would remain an intellectual concept to be only talked of and debated. But for a growing number of humans, this consciousness would become exponentially real because these individuals would experience flashes or glimpses of this state of mind during the course of their lives. The manuscript said that this experience was the key to ending human conflict in the world, because during this experience, we are receiving energy from another source, a source we will eventually learn to tap at will. I stopped reading and looked at the young priest again. His eyes were open, and he appeared to be looking directly at me. I nodded even though I couldn't make out the details of his face. To my surprise, he nodded back at me and smiled faintly. Then he stood up and walked toward my left, heading toward the house in that direction. He avoided my eyes as I watched him cross the courtyard and entered the dwelling. Behind me, I heard footsteps and turned to see Sanchez leaving the church. He smiled as he approached me. "That didn't take long," he said. "Would you like to see more of the grounds?" "Yes, I would," I replied. "Tell me about these sitting areas you have." I pointed toward the area where the young priest had been. "Let's walk up there," he said. As we strolled across the courtyard, Sanchez told me that the mission was over 400 years old and was founded by a unique missionary from Spain who felt the way to convert the local Indians was through their hearts, not through coronation with the sword. The approach had worked, Sanchez went on, and partly because of the success and partly due to the remote location, the priest had been left alone to follow his own course. "We carried on his tradition of looking inward for the truth," Sanchez had said. The sitting area was landscaped immaculately. About half an acre of dense forest had been cleaned, and the brushes and flowering plants beneath were interspersed with walkways made of smooth river stone like those in the courtyard, and the plants here were also spaced perfectly, accentuating their unique shape. Where would you like to sit down? Sanchez asked. I guess I'm going to have to stop there. And we'll come back. Presumably on Saturday. The doors being. Just a second. Yeah, just